Right now, you're using modern technology to watch this video. Maybe on a smartphone engineered with billion transistor processors. Maybe on a computer connected to a global network of information. You're probably sitting in a building constructed with materials sourced from around the country, assembled using human knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. You speak a complex language with thousands of words. You can read, write, plan for tomorrow, remember yesterday, imagine things that don't exist and then figure out how to make them real. Now here's what's crazy. A human from 200,000 years ago, living in the American heartland, would have looked almost identical to you. Same size brain, same body, same basic human biology. If you dressed them in modern clothing and put them on a subway in New York City, you probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. Anatomically, they were us, but behaviorally, they were living in a completely different world. For roughly 150,000 years, these anatomically modern humans existed in the Great Plains doing essentially the same things generation after generation. Simple Stone Age tools. Small groups. No art. No jewelry. No evidence of complex language or abstract thinking. No indication that they were destined to become the most dominant species the continent has ever seen. Then, around 50,000 years ago, something changed. And when I say something changed, I mean everything exploded. Suddenly, humans are creating sophisticated tools. They're making art, carving figurines, painting canyon walls with stunning images of animals and symbols. They're crafting jewelry, developing advanced weaponry, and inventing new technologies at a pace never seen before. They're burying their dead with elaborate burial rituals. They're building rafts and crossing the Gulf. They're moving into environments that should have killed them, from the frozen peaks of the Rockies to the scorching Mojave Desert, and thriving. Within just 30,000 years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, humans had spread to every corner of the land. They'd driven multiple other human species to extinction. They'd wiped out megafauna that had dominated their ecosystems for millions of years. They'd developed hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and technologies. The land had never seen anything like it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Chicago at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, Houston at dinner, all experiencing this story of humanity together. So what happened? What changed around 50,000 years ago that turned anatomically modern humans who'd been doing the same basic things for 150,000 years into the creative, innovative, world-conquering species we recognize today? This is the central mystery of our human evolution. Scientists call it the cognitive revolution. Whatever you call it, it's the moment when humans stopped being just another clever primate and became something unprecedented in history. Was it a genetic mutation that rewired our brains? A cultural innovation that spread like wildfire? A change in population size that allowed new ideas to accumulate? The mastery of complex language that let us share knowledge across generations? Or something else entirely that we haven't figured out yet? Here's what makes this mystery even more fascinating. We know when this transformation happened. We can see it clearly in the archaeological record. Around 50,000 years ago, sites across the continent suddenly start showing up packed with evidence of symbolic thinking, technological innovation, and cultural complexity. But understanding when something happened isn't the same as understanding why. For decades, anthropologists have been locked in fierce debate. Some argue the change was sudden, triggered by a specific genetic mutation that gave us modern cognition. Others insist it was gradual, that the seeds of modern human behavior were always there, just waiting for the right environmental conditions to flourish. Still others point to cultural evolution, arguing that humans crossed some critical threshold where population density allowed innovations to spread faster than they could be lost. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of all these evolutionary theories. But to understand what happened 50,000 years ago, we need to start at the beginning. We need to trace the full 250,000-year journey of our prehistoric ancestors from our origins in the Great Plains to the moment we became truly unstoppable. This is a story about transformation, about a species that spent 80% of its existence doing almost nothing remarkable, then suddenly became remarkable at everything. It's about the long, slow burn of human potential, and the explosive moment when that potential was finally unleashed. So let's go back, way back, to where it all began in the vast grasslands of the American Midwest 250,000 years ago, when the first anatomically modern humans were taking their first breaths, with absolutely no idea that their distant descendants would one day walk on the moon. Let's go back to the very beginning, not to the population bottleneck we just discussed, not to the species divergence, but to the actual origin point, the moment when something that wasn't quite us became something that was. Around 250,000 years ago, somewhere in the Dakotas, the first humans who would look anatomically modern to our eyes were being born. They weren't appearing out of nowhere. Natural selection doesn't work that way. They were emerging gradually from earlier populations through thousands of generations of incremental change. But at some point, the changes accumulated enough that we can point to fossil skulls and say, that's one of us. Now, here's what's wild about this transition. These early humans had almost everything we have physically. Take a skeleton from 250,000 years ago, clean it up, put it in a modern anatomy textbook, and most students wouldn't notice anything unusual. The skull shape, more rounded, check. The face, flatter, check. The chin, actually present, check. The body proportions, adapted for the plains, check. Their brains were essentially our size. So physically, neurologically, anatomically, these were modern humans. If you could somehow grab a baby from 250,000 years ago and raise them in modern-day Denver, they'd fit right in. They'd learn to read, use smartphones, probably complain about traffic, and argue on social media just like everyone else. But here's the thing that's puzzled archaeologists for decades. Despite having modern brains and modern bodies, these early humans weren't doing particularly modern things. And understanding why requires understanding the world they lived in. Picture the Midwest 250,000 years ago. This isn't the farmland you see today. This is Ice Age America, and it's nothing like you'd imagine. While massive ice sheets were covering Canada and the northern states, the heartland wasn't just cornfields. It was going through wild climate swings, periods of intense aridity punctuated by brief wet phases. The Great Lakes filled and emptied over thousands of years. Forests expanded and contracted. The human populations trying to survive in this environment were small. Not just small, but fragmented, scattered across vast territories in tiny groups that might go years without encountering other humans. We're talking populations in the low thousands. These aren't cities or even villages like St. Louis. These are extended family bands of 20 to 40 individuals, camping near rivers, following bison herds, and practicing hunter-gatherer survival strategies. The fossil evidence for these earliest modern humans is maddeningly sparse. We have fragmentary remains from sites in the Badlands dated to ancient times. But here's what we don't have. We don't have much evidence that these people were doing anything particularly special with those big modern brains. The stone tools from this period are certainly more sophisticated than what came before. They're making carefully shaped points, probably for spears. They're creating scrapers and cutting tools. They understand heat treatment, learning that you can improve the quality of flint by heating it in fires. This is genuine technological innovation. These aren't just picking up rocks. They're planning. They're teaching these skills to their children. But here's the puzzling part. This stone tool technology doesn't change much. Look at stone tools from 250,000 years ago, then look at tools from 200,000 years ago. They're remarkably similar. Same basic designs. There's innovation, but it's incredibly slow. If these people had fully modern cognitive abilities, why weren't they innovating faster? The answer probably lies in those population numbers. Remember, we're talking about tiny scattered groups, isolated from each other by hundreds of miles of hostile territory. When you have a population of only a few thousand people spread across 1 million square miles, innovation becomes incredibly difficult to sustain. Sure, maybe one genius in one group figures out a better way to make spear points. But if that knowledge doesn't spread to other groups, it dies with them. One drought, one disease outbreak, one hunting accident, and that innovation is gone forever. This is the cruel mathematics of small populations. Innovation requires not just intelligence, but also numbers. You need enough people that someone occasionally has a brilliant idea. You need enough social connections that the idea can spread. Early humans had the intelligence, but they didn't have the numbers or the connectivity. They were trapped in a low-density equilibrium, smart enough to innovate, but too scattered to build on those innovations systematically. The environment they lived in made everything harder. The climate kept changing. A valley in Nebraska that provided abundant resources for one generation might become an uninhabitable dust bowl in the next. Survival required flexibility. You needed to maintain a broad toolkit. This selected for intelligence and adaptability, but it worked against the kind of cumulative cultural evolution that drives rapid technological change. Think about it from the perspective of a band trying to survive. You've got maybe 30 people, a few children, a few elderly individuals who carry crucial knowledge, and a group of adults who need to spend most of their time finding food. How much time and energy can you devote to experimentation? If you're barely surviving, adopting an unproven new method could mean death for your entire group. So, you stick with what works. You teach your children the same skills your parents taught you. You maintain the traditions. This conservative approach to survival makes perfect sense. The groups that survived were the ones that didn't take unnecessary risks. Innovation happened, but slowly, cautiously. The archaeological record reflects this reality. We see the same basic stone technology across vast regions. There's regional variation, sure. Different groups in the Ozarks versus the plains developing slightly different styles. But there's no exponential acceleration. What we also don't see is much evidence of symbolic behavior. There's no art, no jewelry, no burial practices with grave goods. They probably had language. Almost certainly, in fact. But they weren't leaving us messages. Does this mean they couldn't? Probably not. More likely, they didn't need to. Or perhaps they didn't have the population size and stability to invest the time. But they were surviving. And in surviving, they were accumulating knowledge. Knowledge about their environment, about animal behavior, about plant properties. Knowledge encoded in stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. They were also accumulating genetic adaptations. Natural selection favored individuals who were just a bit smarter, a bit more socially skilled. Over thousands of generations, those tiny advantages accumulated. So by 200,000 years ago, we have a species that looks fully modern, thinks in fundamentally modern ways, but doesn't yet act particularly modern. They're the seed from which modern human culture would eventually grow. They couldn't know what was coming. They couldn't know that their descendants would face near extinction, that survivors of that bottleneck would split into distinct groups, that eventually one of those groups would come to dominate the entire continent. They were just trying to survive. But in surviving, they set the stage for everything that came after. So we've established that anatomically modern humans emerged. We've seen them survive climate disasters. Now comes the part of the story that's going to challenge everything you think you know. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. For the next 100,000 years, almost nothing happened. 100,000 years. For all that time, human culture barely changed. Picture yourself back there, somewhere around 180,000 years ago. You're part of a small group living somewhere in the foothills of the Rockies. Your days are consumed with survival, finding food, avoiding predators like dire wolves. You make tools, sure, hand axes that haven't changed in design for ages. You're smart, absolutely as smart as any modern human. But you're not inventing new technologies every generation. You're surviving. And here's the truly humbling part. You weren't alone. The mountain folk, Neanderthals, were doing the same thing in the Appalachians and the North. Robust, cold-adapted, just as intelligent as you. The desert people, Denisovans, were spreading across the southwest. All three groups of humans, all equally smart, all essentially stuck in neutral. The archaeological record from this period is frustratingly repetitive. Site after site shows the same basic toolkit. But this doesn't mean nothing was happening. The climate was still throwing everything it had at our ancestors. Between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, the land went through multiple cycles. Wet phases when the desert bloomed. Dry phases when populations retreated to refuges near the Mississippi, clinging to survival. The genetic evidence shows just how close we came to extinction. Multiple population bottlenecks. Some estimates suggest there were periods when the entire human population might have been as low as 10,000 individuals. These bottlenecks were the inevitable result of climate fluctuations. When the rains failed, people starved. When disease swept through, whole groups disappeared. When the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted, populations collapsed. Put yourself back there again. Maybe 140,000 years ago, when a particularly severe drought is gripping the plains. Your group used to number 40 people. Now you're down to 15. The elders tell stories about better times, about territories to the north, but those places are dust now. You're living off roots. You're smart enough to understand what's happening, but you don't have the tools to fix it. You can't dig deep wells. You can't move your entire group hundreds of miles because you don't have the social networks. So you stay put. This was the reality for our ancestors during the long plateau. Constant crisis management. But every so often, there were hints, tiny glimmers. Around 100,000 years ago, at a cave site in Kentucky, let's call it Mammoth Cave, some humans did something remarkable. They started collecting ochre, red iron oxide pigment. They weren't using it for practical purposes. They were using it to make patterns, abstract engravings, geometric designs. They were creating symbols. This is huge. This is evidence of abstract thinking. But here's what's weird. These engravings appear, persist for a few thousand years, and then disappear. Later groups don't seem to use ochre the same way. The innovation doesn't spread. It doesn't take hold. This pattern repeats. Occasional flashes of innovation that don't go anywhere. A site in Florida from around 120,000 years ago shows evidence of people systematically harvesting shellfish. Impressive, but it didn't spread. And then there were the expeditions. Around 120,000 years ago, some groups left the heartland and moved toward the Ohio Valley. They lived there for thousands of years, but they didn't go farther, and eventually they disappeared. Maybe they were outcompeted by the mountain folk who knew the territory better. Maybe they just went extinct. Whatever happened, these early pioneers left no descendants. The people living on the coasts today don't trace their ancestry to this first migration. This tells us something important. Our ancestors had the physical ability to leave and colonize. They had the intelligence. What they lacked was something else. Some combination of cultural knowledge and social organization. Meanwhile, the mountain folk were doing just fine in the Appalachians, perfectly adapted to the cold. Master hunters. They were making complex tools. They were just as advanced. The desert people were equally successful in the Southwest. They were survivors, just like us. Then there's the art. The art blows minds. The first cave paintings appear. Sophisticated representations of bison and horses. Carved figurines like the Venus of Vermont appear. Musical instruments, bone flutes, appear in the record. Personal ornaments explode. Beads made from shells and stones transported hundreds of miles. Burial practices become elaborate. Bodies positioned carefully, buried with tools and ornaments. At a site in Montana, archaeologists found children buried in clothing decorated with thousands of beads. This implies massive community investment and complex beliefs about death. Hunting became systematic. Projectile weapons, organized game drives. Humans became the most effective predators. They had more diverse diets. Most importantly, all this points to fully modern language. You can't teach composite tools or coordinate massive hunts without it. You can't create symbolic art without it. So there they stood, a small group on the edge of the Ohio Valley. They had no idea they were about to change the world. Sometime around 70,000 years ago, a few hundred modern humans successfully left the heartland and established populations in the west and south. And this time, it worked. Within 30,000 years, they'd spread to every corner of the continent. They took the coastal route. Coastlines are buffets of resources. Following the Gulf Coast or the Pacific Coast allowed them to use known skills while adapting. They reached the Channel Islands off California by 65,000 years ago, requiring seaworthy boats and navigation skills. Imagine Joe and his family in a wooden boat, paddling into the unknown Pacific, spotting land on the horizon. While some sailed, others walked. They headed into the territories of the mountain folk. They met. They weren't always hostile. We know they interbred. Today, if your ancestry is from outside the heartland, you carry Neanderthal DNA. Hundreds of genes that help fight disease or adapt to cold. But the mountain folk disappeared as a distinct group. Modern humans adapted to diverse environments, from the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest to the arid deserts of the Southwest. They adapted fast. Within a few thousand years, they'd spread everywhere. But as they conquered new territories, something tragic happened. The megafauna died. When humans entered the West, they found mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths. Within a few thousand years, they were gone. Was it climate change? Was it overhunting by humans with their new, effective technology? Probably a combination. But the result was clear. The great beasts vanished. By 12,900 years ago, just as things were looking stable, the climate went haywire again, the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted. Glaciers surged. Forests died back. But this time, humans didn't just survive. They innovated. In the Mississippi Valley, people facing a resource crisis made a choice. They didn't go back to full nomadism. They started experimenting. They noticed that if you collected seeds from the best plants and planted them, you got better harvests. They started cultivating sunflowers and marsh elder. They started managing herds. Before they knew it, they were farmers. Agriculture appeared independently in multiple places, the Southwest with maize, the East with squash and sunflowers. This created population pressure. More people meant more demand for land. Agricultural societies bumped into each other. They went to war. Systematically. Fortified settlements appear. Mass graves appear. But agriculture also allowed for cities. Cahokia, Choco Canyon, civilization. We are the descendants of those survivors. We carry that legacy, the ability to innovate, to adapt, to build on the past. We are the species that survived the bottleneck, survived Yellowstone, and invented the future. And the story isn't over. We're still evolving, still innovating. The challenges we face today, climate, resources, are the same ones our ancestors faced, just on a larger scale. If there's one lesson from this journey, it's that humans are really, really good at adapting. So, thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found this fascinating, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what do you think makes us truly special? Thanks for watching. And remember, you're the product of survival and innovation. Act like it.